Two young sisters vanished on their way to school, leaving a family shattered and a town gripped by fear. For decades, their neighbor Carl Henderson lived quietly among them, hiding the unthinkable truth. Then, a drought uncovered the secret he thought would stay buried forever. But just listen to how shocking the twist in this drama turned out to be, and why justice ultimately prevailed. The morning the Carter sisters disappeared carried no warning, no omen of what was about to unfold. October in Fairview was always a time of ritual, the air sharp with wood smoke, porches crowded with pumpkins, children tugging sweaters tighter on their way to school. That day was no different, at least not to anyone watching. Emily Carter, 12 years old and already tall for her age, was walking a step ahead of her sister Grace. Emily's pace was brisk, purposeful, the stride of someone who disliked being late, while Grace, 9, trailed with the distracted buoyancy of a child who still believed the world was as safe as her own backyard. They were last seen together at 7:42 a.m. when a neighbor pulling out of her driveway waved as the girls passed. To her, it was an ordinary snapshot of childhood. Two sisters, backpacks bouncing against their shoulders, laughing about something only they understood. The Carter family lived on the east side of town, in a modest 2-story house with peeling white paint and a maple tree that leaned toward the sidewalk like a watchful sentinel. Daniel Carter had already left for work at the paper mill by the time the girls set out. He always left early, proud of the consistency that kept food on the table. Laura, their mother, was at the kitchen sink rinsing breakfast dishes when she watched her daughters vanish around the bend of Maplewood Lane. She would later replay that image endlessly, torturing herself with its ordinariness. Had Emily looked back? Had Grace called out something she hadn't heard? The memory hardened into a wound she would carry for the rest of her life. When the school secretary phoned at 8:45 a.m. to ask why the girls hadn't arrived, Laura's first reaction was confusion rather than alarm. She thought perhaps they had stopped at a friend's house, or that Emily had turned around with Grace because of forgotten homework. By 9 o'clock, confusion had given way to dread. She drove the familiar route 3 times, windows rolled down, calling their names until her voice cracked. Her panic grew in increments, the way shadows lengthen across a field. Slow at first, then suddenly overwhelming. The first officers arrived by mid-morning. Fairview's police department was small, accustomed to traffic stops and the occasional burglary, not the disappearance of children. Still, they moved quickly, canvassing neighbors, retracing the path from the Carters' home to the elementary school. By noon, volunteers had gathered, parents, teachers, teenagers who had grown up with Emily and Grace. They spread across the fields, shouting into thickets, checking drainage ditches, scouring playgrounds. Dogs were brought in by afternoon. The girls' names echoed across the woods, carried by voices trembling between urgency and disbelief. But the trail was barren. No abandoned backpacks, no footprints in the mud, no torn fabric snagged on branches. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. That eerie absence of evidence, of sound, of any logical explanation, cast a suffocating pall over the town. In the early hours, people reassured themselves with common-sense theories. Maybe the girls had decided to skip school, hiding somewhere to avoid getting in trouble. Maybe they were playing a prank. But as evening fell and the temperature dropped, that fragile optimism dissolved. Children who once roamed freely down Maplewood Lane were now kept indoors. Porch lights flickered on before dusk. Conversations in grocery aisles grew hushed, as though speaking too loudly about the missing sisters might summon something unspeakable. For Daniel, the news arrived at the mill in the form of a foreman pulling him aside, face pale, telling him his wife had called. He sped home in a blur, the weight of unspoken fears pressing on his chest. By the time he reached the house, squad cars were already stationed at the curb, radios crackling. Laura met him at the door, eyes swollen, voice broken. He wrapped his arms around her, but even in that moment, a terrible awareness struck him. He had no words to shield her, no authority to restore what was already gone. Fairview had seen hardships before, factory layoffs, floods, fires, but nothing like this. This was different. This was not damage you could rebuild, not a storm you could wait out. This was the kind of rupture that spread roots into the soul of a town, reshaping how every parent looked at their children, how every neighbor looked at one another. By nightfall, Maplewood Lane had become both a crime scene and a pilgrimage site. Flashlights bobbed in the darkness, reporters arrived from nearby cities, and the Carter house filled with relatives murmuring prayers that no longer sounded hopeful. Somewhere between dusk and midnight, when officers finally admitted they had found nothing, not a sign, not a clue, the truth settled like a weight on every chest. Emily and Grace had not simply wandered off. They had been taken, and the silence that followed was worse than any sound. In the months following Emily and Grace's disappearance, the Carter household became a monument to absence. Their shared bedroom, painted a soft lavender, remained untouched. The beds were still made with the last set of sheets Laura had washed, Emily's pillow flattened from the way she liked to sleep curled on her side, Grace's blanket tucked half-heartedly because she always rushed through chores. On the dresser sat a row of dolls, plastic faces staring outward, each one collecting dust like silent witnesses. Laura could not bring herself to move a single object. To her, the room was a shrine, proof that her daughters had existed, that their laughter and voices had once filled the house. Friends encouraged her to pack things away for now, thinking it would help her heal, but to Laura, such an act would feel like surrender. She refused to let their absence become permanent. Daniel, by contrast, sought refuge in the numbing routine of work. The paper mill, noisy and suffocating to some, became a kind of absolution for him. There, machines drowned out his thoughts, and exhaustion dulled the ache. He carried a private guilt that gnawed at him relentlessly. If he had simply driven the girls that morning, if he had delayed his shift by even 10 minutes, perhaps they would have arrived at school unharmed. He replayed that choice in his mind endlessly, as though the past could be bent by sheer force of regret. The guilt, though irrational, was immovable, and over time it carved a distance between him and Laura. Where she clung to hope, he buried himself deeper in denial, each convinced the other was coping the wrong way. The investigation, at first, surged with intensity. Police treated the disappearance as an abduction, but without clear evidence, theories multiplied like weeds. Strangers passing through town were questioned. Truck drivers and traveling salesmen were scrutinized. Neighbors who had waved to the girls that morning suddenly found themselves interviewed under suspicion. Even extended family members were not exempt. The absence of leads created a vacuum, and into that vacuum poured suspicion, rumor, and resentment. Fairview, once a town where everyone claimed to know each other, began to fracture under the pressure. Coffee shops buzzed with speculation, and church parking lots became forums of whispered accusations. It must have been someone close, people said. Children don't just vanish. That certainty bred cruelty. A neighbor recalled seeing Laura smoking on her porch the evening after the girls went missing, and the comment spread into a venomous rumor. What kind of mother smokes while her children are gone? Another resident muttered that Daniel didn't look distraught enough, as though grief had a prescribed expression. What began as community support slowly soured into judgment, each person eager to distance themselves from suspicion by pointing the finger elsewhere. The police, stretched thin and increasingly defensive, shifted focus every few weeks. First, they leaned into the stranger danger narrative, circulating sketches of a suspicious man seen near the school. When no one matched the description, they turned inward, scrutinizing family members with polygraphs and endless interviews. Laura endured hours of questioning, her grief dissected and measured against what detectives considered appropriate maternal behavior. Daniel, stoic and subdued, was asked if his work schedule gave him opportunity to harm his own children. Each insinuation left scars that lingered long after investigators moved on. As the years dragged forward, each potential lead collapsed into disappointment. A reported sighting in Ohio. False. A pair of shoes discovered near a rest stop. Unrelated. Anonymous tips arrived by phone and letter, some sincere, many cruel. One caller claimed the girls had run away. Another insisted Daniel had hidden them. Each tip reignited Laura's fragile hope, only to extinguish it again, leaving her weaker, more hollow than before. By the 5th year, the case was declared cold. The file was thinned to a binder of interviews, faded photographs, and maps marked with circles that led nowhere. For Fairview, the mystery became less urgent and more of a background hum, like a persistent but distant storm. Families moved on, children grew up, and new tragedies claimed the town's attention. But for the Carters, time did not soften the wound, it calcified it. Every holiday was a reminder of 2 empty chairs at the table, every birthday a cruel marker of years stolen. And yet, Laura never relinquished her conviction. At vigils, in interviews, or in private conversation, she repeated the same phrase with unwavering certainty. Someone in this town knows what happened. To her, the silence of Fairview was not ignorance, but complicity. She believed the truth was woven into the fabric of the community, hidden behind locked doors, tucked into guilty glances, protected by fear or shame. That belief gave her strength when everything else had been stripped away. For Daniel, those words were both a comfort and a torment. He wanted to believe her, but the idea that someone they had known, trusted, perhaps even greeted on the sidewalk, could have stolen his daughters. It was unbearable. So he kept quiet, burying himself in work, while Laura carried the torch of memory alone. The town grew weary of the Carters' grief, tired of the way it kept a mirror raised to their own unresolved fear. But Laura did not care. As the years turned into decades, she refused to let silence close the case. Hope, to her, was not naive. It was an act of defiance. And it was that defiance, unyielding and sharp as glass, that kept the memory of Emily and Grace alive in a town that would have preferred to forget. The summer of 2021 pressed down on Fairview, like a hand refusing to let the town breathe. The drought had lingered for weeks, turning lawns brittle and yellow, cracking the soil until it split like broken porcelain. Farmers cursed at the skies, wells ran shallow, and every conversation seemed to circle back to the heat. It was under this unrelenting sun that a construction crew began clearing a tract of farmland on the outskirts of town, a piece of property long abandoned, its fence posts leaning, its fields wild with thistles. The plan was to level it for new housing developments, subdivisions with names meant to inspire comfort: Maplewood Estates, Meadowlark Crossing. On the 3rd day of excavation, one of the workers noticed the ground sagging near the tree line, the earth caving inward as though exhaling after decades of holding its breath. The backhoe's bucket scraped against stone, revealing a circular formation partially hidden by weeds and brush. At first glance, it was nothing remarkable, an old well, the kind scattered across rural properties, relics from when families had drawn water by hand. But this one was sealed with boards long since rotted, edges blackened by moisture, the wood so brittle it disintegrated at the touch. Curiosity turned quickly to unease. Wells, by nature, were hazards, but this one carried an aura of deliberate concealment. The crew chief halted work and called the county sheriff's office. Deputies arrived, expecting to tape off a safety hazard. Instead, they found themselves peering into a void that felt deeper than its physical depth. When one officer lowered a flashlight between the gaps, the beam revealed a collection of shapes at the bottom, faint but undeniable. A scrap of faded fabric, a small shoe, its sole warped but intact. And further beneath, something pale, angular, and unmistakably human. The scene shifted instantly from routine to catastrophic. Crime scene tape went up, the construction crew was sent home, and within hours, the well became the center of a swarm of vehicles: sheriff's cruisers, forensic vans, unmarked cars carrying detectives who had worked the Carter case decades earlier. Reporters weren't far behind. The drought, indifferent to human grief, had unearthed what 22 years of searching had failed to find. By the time forensic teams began their descent, the weight of collective realization had already spread through Fairview like wildfire. The Carter sisters had been found. It was not yet confirmed, not yet official, but the evidence spoke with a cruel clarity. For decades, parents had told their children to stay away from strangers, to be careful walking to school, to keep close to home. For decades, rumors had churned about traveling criminals, about secret runaway plans, about neighbors who seemed off. All that noise collapsed into silence at the mouth of the well. The girls had been here, less than 3 miles from their home, concealed in the earth while their parents searched the world. The well itself became an object of morbid fascination. Locals who had driven past the farmland for years admitted they never noticed it, hidden by brush and neglect. Some remembered the property belonging to the Henderson family in the late 90s. Others claimed it had stood vacant since before then. The stonework was old, weathered, its mortar crumbling in places, suggesting it had been dug generations earlier. To investigators, that detail mattered less than the boards laid across its top. Clear evidence that someone at some point had wanted it closed, not for safety, but for secrecy. The recovery was slow, deliberate. Each item lifted from the darkness was catalogued, photographed, bagged. Pieces of fabric clung to themselves in damp knots, colors faded into anonymity. The small shoes, though warped, still bore the bright designs of children's footwear from the late 90s. And then, with a care that made seasoned deputies look away, the skeletal remains were brought up. 2 sets. Small. Fragile. The silence among the assembled officers and technicians was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of cicadas in the heat. Forensic experts would later confirm what Hartz already knew. The remains belonged to Emily and Grace Carter. 22 years of unanswered questions had collapsed into a single, devastating answer. They had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, beneath the soil of a town that had searched, speculated, and suffered without resolution. The well, once an afterthought in the corner of an overgrown field, was now the center of everything. A crime scene, a tomb, a symbol of betrayal. Its discovery reopened wounds that had never healed and forced Fairview to confront an unbearable truth, that while people had built theories and pointed fingers, the truth had been quietly rotting beneath their feet. And for the Carter family, the unthinkable had become undeniable. The daughters they had searched for in dreams, in prayers, in endless vigils, had never left home. News traveled faster than official statements. Before the sheriff's office had even issued a press release, whispers spread from construction workers to spouses, from deputies to friends, from one phone call to a dozen others. By evening, the edge of the farmland was crowded with townspeople standing behind the yellow tape, drawn by a mixture of dread and compulsion. Some crossed their arms tightly as if to guard against the horror seeping from the well. Others craned their necks for glimpses of forensic vans. Parents clutched their children close, though the danger was no longer present. It had happened decades ago. Still, the knowledge that the Carter sisters had been found, not far from their own homes, seemed to warp the air itself. Fairview was no stranger to rumors, but this was different. The return of Emily and Grace, reduced to bones, shoes, and scraps of clothing, validated fears people had carried in silence for years. It also ignited a fresh wave of speculation, darker and sharper than before. Clusters of neighbors whispered names with lowered voices. Didn't he own that land back then? What about the handyman? He was always too friendly. Each theory passed like static through the crowd, fueled not by evidence, but by the unbearable need to assign blame. The well was no longer just a physical sight. It was a mirror, forcing the town to confront its suspicions, its failures, and its own complicity in forgetting. When the sheriff's office confirmed the discovery to the Carters, the weight of 22 years collapsed in an instant. Laura's body gave out before the words were finished, knees buckling as if struck. For decades she had balanced on the knife's edge between hope and despair, insisting that her daughters were out there, alive, waiting to be found. The confirmation that they had been buried within the very town that had pitied her, doubted her, even whispered against her. It was both devastation and vindication. Her cries, neighbors would later recall, carried farther than the cicadas that evening. Daniel absorbed the news in silence, his face drained of color, hands clenched until his knuckles whitened. His grief had calcified over 2 decades into a grim endurance, and now the truth shattered even that. He did not fall or cry out like Laura. Instead, he stood rigid, jaw tight, staring into nothing. Only one question escaped his lips, quiet but heavy enough to hang over every person in the room. Who put them there? It was not rhetorical. It was an accusation hurled into the void, demanding an answer no one yet dared to give. The town's collective memory rewound to 1999. Every parent who had walked their children to school that week remembered the fear that had spread like fire. Every teenager who had joined the search recalled the cold dread of combing fields for friends they would never find. The resurfacing of the sisters' remains collapsed those memories into the present, as if time itself had folded, refusing to allow closure. People who had moved on with marriages, children, and mortgages found themselves pulled back to that October morning, reminded that Fairview had never truly escaped the shadow of the girl's disappearance. In homes across town, conversations replayed with an edge of paranoia. Spouses questioned one another's recollections of who lived near the farmland, who was in town that week, who behaved strangely at the time. Neighbors who had once shared cups of sugar now avoided each other's eyes at the grocery store. The discovery did not only expose the girls, it exposed the fragility of trust in a community that had convinced itself it was safe. Laura, confined to her bed in the days after, spoke little except to repeat what she had always said. Someone in this town knows. Her words, once dismissed as the desperate refrain of a grieving mother, now rang like prophecy. Reporters recorded them, replayed them, and soon they echoed in every conversation in Fairview. The weight of those words was unbearable, for it meant the horror was not an accident, not the work of a faceless drifter who had vanished into the horizon. It meant the monster had lived among them. Meanwhile, Daniel retreated into silence, as if conserving his energy for the reckoning ahead. Friends described him as hollow-eyed, standing for hours in the backyard with fists clenched, his gaze fixed on nothing. For years, he had endured the unspoken blame of a town that judged him for not driving his daughters that morning. Now, with the discovery, the blame shifted outward, but Daniel could not shake the sense that he had failed. His fists were not only clenched at the killer, they were clenched at himself. The farmland, once slated for cheerful subdivisions, had transformed into sacred ground. Flowers appeared at the police tape, stuffed animals lined the road, candles flickered in jars. The makeshift memorial grew daily, each offering an act of grief, apology, or repentance. The sight of it carried a paradoxical weight, comfort in solidarity, horror in acknowledgement. Fairview could no longer pretend ignorance. The evidence lay in plain sight, and silence was no longer a refuge. The town was in shock, but beneath that shock simmered a dangerous truth. Shock inevitably gives way to anger. And in Fairview, anger was already beginning to take shape. When the well yielded its secrets, detectives reopened the Carter file with a scrutiny sharper than ever before. The old binders, once gathering dust on steel shelves, were hauled back into conference rooms under fluorescent lights. Pages yellowed by time were spread across tables, names highlighted, timelines redrawn. Detectives who had worked the case in the late 90s now sat beside younger colleagues trained in forensic methods that hadn't existed when Emily and Grace vanished. Every interview, every lead, every casual note scribbled in the margins was reconsidered with new urgency. It was within those early files that a name resurfaced: Carl Henderson. In 1999, Henderson had been a man in his early 40s, living alone in a sagging bungalow 2 streets from the Carters. His reputation at the time was oddly split. To some, he was merely eccentric, a quiet man who mowed lawns for cash and patched fences when neighbors needed cheap labor. To others, particularly parents, he was unsettling. Henderson was known for giving out candy to local children, sometimes on Halloween, but also on ordinary afternoons, a gesture that blurred the line between kindness and intrusion. He had once offered rides to kids walking home from school, insisting it was safer than letting them walk along busy roads. Most parents discouraged their children from accepting, though a few admitted they had allowed it in moments of convenience. When the sisters vanished, Henderson had been questioned briefly. His alibi was vague but not contradictory. He claimed to have been repairing a roof that morning for a family across town. No witnesses remembered anything suspicious. In an era before DNA swabs and fiber analysis were commonplace in small-town investigations, Henderson's truck was searched superficially. Officers found nothing damning, and he was dismissed as odd but harmless. The case pressed forward, chasing more dramatic leads, while Henderson receded into the background, blending back into the rhythm of town life. 2 decades later, technology had advanced beyond the crude capabilities of that first investigation. Items recovered from the well, Emily's sweater, Grace's shoes, fragments of fabric clinging to bone, were submitted to modern forensic labs. Under microscopes and with chemical extraction, evidence invisible in 1999 revealed itself. Embedded in the fibers of Emily's sweater were strands consistent with upholstery from an older model pickup truck. Records from the original case listed the make and model of Henderson's vehicle at the time, a faded green Ford F-150. The match was not immediate proof of guilt, but it transformed Henderson from a forgotten eccentric into a central figure. Detectives reviewed his life in the intervening years. He had never left Fairview. For 22 years, Henderson had lived quietly, working odd jobs, trimming hedges, fixing siding, all while attending Sunday services in the back pew and shopping at the same grocery store as everyone else. He nodded politely to neighbors, kept his yard orderly, and never caused enough trouble to warrant more than passing notice. This normalcy, in retrospect, felt sinister. The idea that a man could carry the weight of such a crime, if indeed he was guilty, and still mow lawns for families who whispered about him, still wave to children on their bikes, still occupy the same space without revealing a crack, chilled the EI town more than any rumor of strangers ever had. He had not fled. He had not unraveled. He had, by all appearances, gone on living. Yet suspicion did not equal certainty. Henderson's defenders, few but vocal, argued that fibers could linger innocently, that children might have brushed against his truck while playing, that contamination was possible after so many years. Others countered with bitterness. Why had he offered rides in the first place? Why had he loitered near the schoolyard, pockets always filled with candy? Old memories resurfaced, sharpened by hindsight. Parents remembered uneasy feelings they had brushed aside, moments when Henderson's friendliness had felt a degree too intimate. One woman recalled her daughter mentioning Henderson had once invited her inside for a soda. At the time, she had dismissed it as nothing. Now the memory felt like a knife twisting. Detectives tread carefully, knowing how fragile evidence could be after decades. They re-interviewed neighbors, tracked down the family for whom Henderson claimed to have been working the morning the sisters vanished. Memories had eroded, but fragments remained, enough to muddy the waters. One man thought Henderson had been there, another could not be certain. The gaps in recollection only deepened the unease. What struck investigators most was the banality of Henderson's existence. Unlike the monstrous figures that often populate crime stories, Henderson had lived as a fixture of the community, his eccentricities tolerated as quirks rather than warnings. He was the man who patched fences before storms, who lent out tools, who helped repair the roof of the VFW hall. For some, the possibility of his guilt was unthinkable. For others, it was the only explanation that made sense, the darkness hiding in plain sight. When detectives approached Henderson in 2021, they found him unchanged, wiry, stooped, with a face weathered by sun and work. He greeted them with the same politeness that had both disarmed and unsettled people for decades. To the officers, the moment was heavy with duality. Either they were speaking to a man who had carried out an unspeakable act and concealed it for 22 years, or they were standing on the threshold of destroying the life of an innocent man who had long been misunderstood. In either case, Henderson was no longer just a name in an old file. He was the embodiment of the question Daniel Carter had spoken the day the well was opened. Who put them there? In Fairview's collective imagination, evil had often been pictured as something foreign, a drifter off the highway, a nameless predator passing through. The idea that harm could originate from inside their own neighborhood had been too much to reconcile. But with Carl Henderson, investigators confronted a reality both simpler and more disturbing. His motive, they believed, was not the product of elaborate schemes or hardened criminality. It was rooted instead in the small, festering wounds of a life marked by loneliness, resentment, and a hunger for control. Carl's childhood had left scars that never faded. His father was known in town as a hard man, quick to strike and slow to praise. Neighbors recalled shouts from the Henderson house in the evenings, the sound of glass breaking, the occasional glimpse of young Carl standing barefoot on the porch as if waiting for the storm inside to pass. His mother, by most accounts, had retreated inward, leaving Carl largely to fend for himself. Teachers described him as withdrawn, sometimes prone to sudden outbursts, but never enough to warrant serious intervention. In a small town where many families bore their own quiet dysfunctions, his plight was neither unusual nor remarkable. Adulthood did not bring escape. Henderson drifted from job to job, never securing steady work beyond odd tasks and seasonal labor. His interactions with others remained stilted, tinged with the awkwardness of someone who had never fully learned the rhythms of companionship. Yet there was another side to him, an eagerness, sometimes too eager, to engage with children. He knew how to win their attention with candy, trinkets, or the promise of animals. "He always had kittens," one neighbor recalled later. Every spring, it seemed. He'd let the kids hold them, stroke them. He smiled most when they were around. What seemed like generosity at the time now appeared with a sinister tint, a calculated effort to cultivate trust where he lacked it with adults. Detectives pieced together a theory of that October morning in 1999. Emily and Grace, walking to school as they had countless times before, may have encountered Henderson along Maplewood Lane. Perhaps he slowed his truck, called out with his familiar offer, an invitation to see new kittens. For Grace, only 9, the allure could have been irresistible. For Emily, older and more cautious, suspicion may have stirred. Investigators believed it was Emily's resistance that derailed Henderson's fragile plan. What he intended, whether to keep them near, to feel needed, or simply to exert control, spiraled into violence when she refused to cooperate. In that moment, panic and desperation overwhelmed him. What followed was not the act of a skilled predator, but of a man unprepared for the consequences of his own impulses. The well on his family's property, long unused and half forgotten, became the hiding place. Henderson had grown up near it, likely knew its depth and obscurity. To him, it offered a solution, a way to conceal the evidence of his failure, to bury both the girls and his own mistake. Investigators found no sign of ritual or elaborate staging, no effort at symbolic meaning. The act was utilitarian, almost crude. Boards were laid across the opening, not out of ceremony, but to prevent discovery. The crime's horror lay not in its complexity, but in its ordinariness. What haunted detectives most was Henderson's silence. For 22 years, he carried on without confession, without breakdown, without the slip-ups that often betray guilt. His ability to live quietly in Fairview, mowing lawns, repairing fences, attending church potlucks, spoke less to cunning than to the disturbing truth that his secret required no maintenance. No one asked, and he did not volunteer. In the absence of evidence, suspicion faded. His survival depended not on brilliance, but on the town's willingness to look elsewhere. To prosecutors, Henderson's motive crystallized as both banal and terrifying. He wanted to feel needed, to hold on to something that would not abandon him. When that illusion faltered, he lashed out in panic, choosing destruction over rejection. Unlike the cinematic villains people imagine, Henderson's cruelty was grounded in ordinary human desires, twisted into violence. The desire to control, the desire not to be left behind. It was this ordinariness that unsettled Fairview most. The man who had waved from his truck, who had patched shingles on neighbors' roofs, who had shared beers at the VFW hall, had carried the darkest secret imaginable, and no one had known. For the Carters, the revelation was both answer and torment. The man responsible had not been a phantom, not a passing stranger, but a face they had seen, a name they had heard, a presence in their very neighborhood. The fact that Henderson had lived among them day after day, year after year, deepened the wound in ways no arrest could heal. In the end, Henderson's motive was disturbingly human. And it was that humanity, not the caricature of a monster, that made his crime so unbearable to contemplate. The farmhouse where Carl Henderson lived sat at the far edge of Fairview, its roof sagging in places, the paint on its siding stripped by decades of weather. It looked less like a home than a relic left behind by time. Leaning fences, weeds curling around rusting farm equipment, the front porch cluttered with tools and buckets he never seemed to put away. On the morning deputies arrived, the place was quiet except for the cicadas rattling in the heat. To anyone watching, the scene could have passed as routine code enforcement, the kind of visit made to remind an old handyman about zoning or property upkeep. But the unmarked cars and the plainclothes officers moving into position told another story. Henderson answered the door slowly, his shoulders hunched, his shirt stained with sweat. His eyes darted past the deputies, scanning the road as though he half expected someone else to appear behind them. When they told him why they were there, the charges, the evidence recovered from his old truck, he didn't protest in the way many expected. No shouted denials, no declarations of innocence. Instead, he muttered, voice barely audible, "It was so long ago," as if time itself might serve as a shield. The words carried no defiance, only fatigue, like a man too worn down to pretend any more. To investigators, it sounded less like confession than resignation. The arrest was swift. Henderson was led down the uneven porch steps in handcuffs, his wrists thin, his gait unsteady. Neighbors who had gathered at the edge of their yards watched in silence. Some whispered to each other, recalling odd moments, how he lingered at bus stops, how he always seemed to appear when children were playing outside. Others shook their heads, refusing to reconcile the man who fixed gutters and shoveled driveways with the horror of what lay at the bottom of that well. At the courthouse, the reaction was anything but quiet. The news had spread faster than deputies could process him. Parents crowded the steps, their voices hoarse with fury. They shouted his name, hurled accusations, demanded to know how he had been allowed to live freely among them for 22 years. Some carried photographs of Emily and Grace Carter, images once taped to telephone poles during the frantic days of 1999. They held them high now, not as pleas for help, but as indictments, proof that the town's innocence had been buried along with those girls. Inside, the Carters arrived under escort. Laura, her face pale and lined with years of grief, collapsed into sobs when she saw Henderson being brought through the corridor. It was not just anguish, it was the bitter confirmation that her intuition had always been right. For years she had repeated the same words, almost like a prayer. Someone in this town knows. And now that someone stood before her, shackled, head bowed, a flesh-and-blood embodiment of every nightmare she had endured, Daniel Carter's reaction was different. His hair had gone gray, his frame thinner, but the anger radiating from him was sharp, controlled. He clenched his fists as Henderson shuffled past, his voice low but cutting. "You lived here. You watched us." To Daniel, the insult was not only the crime itself, but the years that followed. The barbecues, the Sunday markets, the ordinary rhythms of town life in which Henderson had participated while they searched, prayed, and wept. Every memory of those decades carried a new layer of betrayal. Detectives who had worked the case in 1999 watched from the gallery, their expressions tight. They remembered questioning Henderson back then, dismissing him as eccentric but harmless. He had slipped through the cracks not because of brilliance, but because of the town's willingness to normalize his oddities. Now, as the evidence came together, Fibers from his truck, patterns of behavior re-examined, the well itself on his family's land. The oversight weighed heavily. For them, Henderson's arrest was both a victory and a reproach. The community's fury grew louder with each passing hour. Outside the courthouse, hand-painted signs appeared. Justice for Emily and Grace. Others were less restrained. Monster next door. In a town where nearly everyone knew the Carters personally, anger became communal, each family picturing their own children in place of the sisters. Henderson's ordinariness, that he had lived quietly, unremarkably all these years, made the horror harder to bear. It suggested that evil had not been hiding in shadows, but sitting on porches, waving from trucks, asking after people's gardens. For investigators, the arrest marked only the beginning of the legal process. For the town, it was a breaking point, a release of tension that had simmered beneath 2 decades of unanswered questions. And for Laura and Daniel, it was not closure. Nothing could restore what had been taken. But it was a reckoning. At last, the man who had stolen their daughters' lives and their own would stand in the light of truth. The courthouse crowd thinned only after nightfall, but the fury lingered in Fairview. Doors that had once remained unlocked were bolted shut. Parents clutched their children tighter. And at the edge of town, Henderson's farmhouse stood in silence, its sagging frame now marked forever as the place where the mask had finally slipped. The trial of Carl Henderson began in the fall of 2022, nearly a year after the discovery in the old well. By then, Fairview had already endured months of headlines, interviews, and speculation. The courthouse, a brick building that usually handled routine disputes, property lines, traffic violations, the occasional burglary, was transformed into a stage for reckoning. Reporters crowded the steps each morning, their cameras angled toward the entrance, while townspeople gathered behind barricades, some holding signs, others simply standing, as though their presence alone could testify to the years of pain. Inside, the courtroom carried a weight that was almost physical. The air felt charged, hushed, even before the proceedings began. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Former classmates of Emily and Grace now sat as adults, their own children at home, struggling to reconcile the memory of 2 smiling girls with the skeletal remains carried out of the earth. The prosecution built its case methodically. They presented the fibers from Henderson's old truck, the forensic analysis confirming matches to Emily's sweater. They displayed photographs of the well, the shoes recovered, the fragile remnants of fabric preserved in evidence bags. Expert witnesses traced timelines, reconstructed probabilities, and explained how Henderson's access to the property, combined with his known behavior toward children, positioned him at the center of suspicion that had gone unpursued in 1999. But facts alone did not define the trial. It was the voices of the Carters that cut through the formality of law and turned the courtroom into something closer to a confessional. Laura Carter was the first to take the stand. Her hands trembled as she unfolded a piece of paper, though she barely looked at it. Her voice wavered, but the words were sharp with years of waiting. She spoke of birthdays marked not with candles, but with silence, of Christmas mornings where 2 stockings hung untouched by the fireplace, of a house that had never stopped feeling incomplete. "You took them from their beds," she said, staring at Henderson, though he never raised his eyes. "Not just Emily and Grace. You took them from their own futures. You took them from ours. And you left us to walk through life with empty hands." Daniel Carter's testimony was quieter, but no less piercing. He did not read from a paper. Instead, he fixed his gaze on Henderson, his voice steady, each word deliberate. "I searched for you in my mind," he said. "For years, I pictured what kind of man could do this. A monster, a stranger, someone beyond understanding. But when I look at you now, all I see is a coward. A man so small that he destroyed 2 children because he couldn't face being ignored." His words, simple and unsparing, landed heavier than the legal arguments that had filled the days prior. Henderson's defense was minimal, almost perfunctory. His attorneys leaned on the passage of time, on the fragility of memory, on the possibility of contamination after 2 decades. But their arguments felt thin against the forensic evidence and the undeniable presence of the Carters' grief. Henderson himself spoke only once, at sentencing. His words were halting, incoherent, a string of mutterings about regret and time. They carried no apology, no ownership, only the echo of the same resignation he had shown at his arrest. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was steady. Guilty on all counts. The sentence, life without parole, was delivered swiftly, without fanfare. Henderson showed no visible reaction, no defiance, no remorse. He was led from the courtroom as quietly as he had entered. But for those watching, the silence that followed was not relief. There was no cheer, no sense of triumph. Instead, it was a heavy acknowledgment that justice, while delivered, could not undo what had been lost. The Carters walked out of the courthouse hand in hand, their faces pale, their bodies rigid with exhaustion. They had waited 22 years for this day, and yet the verdict did not bring closure, only confirmation of what they already knew. Their daughters were gone, and nothing in this world could return them. Outside, the crowd dispersed slowly, the autumn air cool against the courthouse steps. Parents clutched their children tighter, whispering reassurances that sounded hollow against the truth now carved into Fairview's history. Henderson would spend the rest of his life behind bars, but the shadow he cast would linger far longer. The trial had ended, but the absence remained. In the days after the verdict, when reporters had packed up their cameras and the courthouse steps stood empty again, Laura Carter asked Daniel to drive her back to the Henderson property. The old farmhouse had already been seized by authorities, its windows boarded, its land cordoned off with fencing. But what drew her there was not the crumbling house or the dirt road lined with weeds. It was the well. The same well where, for 22 years, her daughters had been hidden in silence while she searched every field, every culvert, every corner of Fairview. The deputies who accompanied them unlocked the chain on the gate and allowed the Carters through. Laura walked slowly, as if the ground itself demanded reverence. The path toward the well was narrow, overgrown with tall grass and thistles, but she pressed on without hesitation. Daniel followed, his steps heavier, his eyes fixed on the ground. Neither spoke. The silence between them had long since become a language of its own. The well sat at the edge of a clearing, its stones weathered, the boards that once concealed it now removed. A protective railing had been placed around it, but otherwise it looked unremarkable, just another remnant of rural life abandoned to time. And yet it radiated an unspeakable weight. For Laura, it was the last link in the chain that had bound her to uncertainty for more than half her life. Here was the truth, unthinkable yet undeniable. She carried a small bouquet of flowers, lilies and daisies, the kind her daughters used to pick in the backyard. She placed them gently on the surface of the water, where they floated in fragile circles, slowly drifting toward the shadows below. Her hand lingered on the stone edge, and she bowed her head. "I found you, my loves," she whispered, her voice breaking but steady enough to carry in the still air. "I never stopped looking." The words were not only for Emily and Grace. They were for herself, for the woman who had fought exhaustion and scorn, who had endured whispers that she was obsessive, even delusional, in refusing to let the case die. Standing at the well, she was finally able to answer those voices, not with triumph, but with proof. Her persistence had not been madness. It had been love, sharpened into resolve. Daniel stood beside her, his shoulders rigid, his jaw tight. For years he had kept his grief folded inward, channeling it into work, into silence, into a kind of stoicism that looked like strength but was only survival. Watching Laura lay the flowers, hearing her voice tremble, yet hold, something in him gave way. His breath hitched, and then came the tears he had denied himself for decades. He wept openly, his whole frame shaking, the sound raw and unguarded. For Laura, it was both unbearable and necessary. At last the dam had broken. They stayed at the well for a long time, neither speaking, the flowers bobbing gently in the dark water below. The clearing was quiet except for the distant sound of wind moving through trees, a sound so ordinary it felt jarring against the enormity of the moment. For the Carters, this was not closure in the way the word is often used. It was not peace, nor forgiveness, nor an end to grief. But it was a kind of settling, a final pinning down of the truth that had eluded them for half their lives. They had names, faces, and a place where the silence ended. When they finally turned to leave, Laura touched the stone one last time, pressing her palm flat against its rough surface as if to anchor herself. Daniel reached for her hand. They walked back down the narrow path together, moving slowly, almost reverently, like mourners leaving a graveside. Behind them, the well remained, no longer hidden, no longer silent. For the first time in 22 years, it was not a secret, but a marker. And though no sentence, no verdict, no ceremony could restore what had been lost, Laura's whispered words lingered in the air, proof that memory had survived, and that love, even fractured by horror, had carried them here. Fairview was not a place built for infamy. It was a town of modest rhythms, its calendar marked more by harvest festivals and Friday night football games than by headlines. Yet after the trial and sentencing, Fairview faced the question of how to live with what had happened, how to carry a history that could not be erased. The answer came not from officials, but from the community itself, in the form of a memorial. Near the elementary school where Emily and Grace Carter had once been headed on that October morning in 1999, 2 stone benches were installed side by side. Their placement was deliberate, just off the main walkway, shaded by a maple tree that turned brilliant red each fall. Engraved into the backs were the girls' names, simple and unadorned, each letter carved deep enough to withstand time. Flowers appeared there in the weeks after the dedication, roses, daisies, even a few stuffed animals weathering in the rain, left by people who had never stopped remembering, even if they rarely spoke about it. The dedication ceremony was quiet. There were no speeches from officials, no cameras permitted past the fence. Instead, townspeople gathered in a semicircle, bowing their heads as a local pastor read a prayer not for justice, already delivered, but for peace. Some wept openly. Others simply stared at the benches as though trying to reconcile the physical permanence of stone with the absence it represented. The Carters attended, though they kept to themselves. Laura traced her fingers across her daughter's names, her lips moving silently. Daniel stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his expression unreadable but taut with emotion. To them, the benches were more than symbols. They were the nearest thing to a grave marker, a place to focus the grief that had stretched across decades, diffuse and unbearable. Now it had a center. Elsewhere in town, another site was altered forever. The well, once sealed in secrecy, then exposed in horror, was filled and capped for good. The county ordered concrete poured over the opening, covering it with a plain slab. No plaque marked the spot. Officials explained that the choice was deliberate. The well was not to be preserved as a monument to violence, but closed as a chapter of concealment. Yet in its absence, it became its own kind of memorial, an unspoken landmark known to all, but rarely acknowledged aloud. For Fairview, the dual presence of remembrance and silence became the balance it needed. Parents who had once crossed the street to avoid Henderson's property no longer had to divert their routes. Children who grew up hearing fragments of the story could now walk past the sealed ground without seeing the void itself. The horror had not been erased, but it had been transformed into something contained, bearable, if never forgotten. The collective memory of the town shifted in subtle ways. At the grocery store, people spoke more gently when the Carters were nearby, their voices lowering out of respect. In classrooms, teachers used the sisters' story carefully, not as folklore, but as a reminder of vigilance, of the fragility of safety. And at night, in kitchens and on porches, the whispers that once carried suspicion and rumor faded. The questions had been answered, however painfully. There was nothing left to speculate. What remained was silence, the kind that follows a storm when the air feels cleared, though the damage still lingers. For 22 years, Fairview had lived beneath a shadow, its residents searching the edges of their own town for a truth that refused to surface. When it finally did, the revelation was brutal, but it was also freeing. The monster had not been a faceless outsider, but a neighbor. The crime had not been cosmic or unknowable, but ordinary in its cruelty. Knowing this was unbearable, but it was also the only way forward. For the Carters, the answers were both wound and salve. They could not restore Emily and Grace, could not erase the birthdays missed or the empty bedrooms, but they could finally place flowers at a site that bore their names. They could speak of their daughters without trailing off into speculation. Closure was too soft a word, but peace, fragile, imperfect, tentative, seemed possible. Fairview itself settled back into routine, but it was never quite the same. The town's history now carried a scar, visible to anyone who looked closely enough. Yet scars are also proof of healing. And so the benches remained, solid and enduring, while the old well lay buried under its slab of concrete. The mystery that had haunted Fairview for more than 2 decades was solved. The shock had hardened into anger, and the anger had finally given way to relief. The well had kept its secret for 22 years, but as history so often shows, truth resists the grave. In Fairview it had risen at last, demanding to be seen, spoken, remembered.